Welcome everyone to another edition of Family Matters. Thank you for all the feedback over previous podcasts. Always appreciate that. Today we have another amazing guest from New Zealand as we bounce around the world. We're back to New Zealand and I'm very pleased to have with me Alex Penk. Hopefully he's known to you through various activities he's been involved with over time. But now he is the leader, the director of something called the Ethos Alliance. And so I thought I'd pull Alex in to talk to us about what this alliance is all about and what it focuses on. So Alex, welcome.
Thanks, Simon. Great to be with you.
So what is this Ethos? Well, sorry, by the way, it is great to have you here. Very conscious that you've been exceptionally busy, particularly as you've set up this new alliance. So to put you right on the spot, what is the Ethos Alliance? What does it do? And where did the name come from?
Yeah. So in a nutshell, I'll try and give you the elevator pitch. We're basically all about promoting freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of belief. And the backstory to that is really a sense that it's actually getting harder for people to be able to express some of their deepest and their most important convictions. We actually commissioned some polling earlier this year where we asked New Zealanders a number of questions connected with conscience issues. And one of the questions we asked was, do you think there should be more tolerance in society for differing beliefs on unpopular or sensitive issues? The examples we gave were gender identity, the Treaty of Waitangi Te Tiriti, hate speech, religion. And in fact, a clear majority, 59% of Kiwis said, yes, we need to have more tolerance for differing beliefs to be expressed than we currently do. Just 11% of people disagreed. So I think that gives you some sort of a sense of the context that we're operating in, which is that in many ways our society's become a bit censorious. And a bit willing, I think, to visit consequences on people who hold the quote unquote the wrong beliefs. And so it's partly what we're seeing is a need that's generated by that kind of environment, but more positively, an opportunity just to help people understand. Look, why does freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of belief matter? Why are these things actually good for each of us as individuals? Why are they good for society as a whole? And it's really that positive message that we'd like to promote. Even as we help people who find themselves in difficult situations, we also want to proactively talk to people about the important contribution that these rights make to what I would call, maybe this is something you want to unpack a little bit, but to what I would call a kind of a fully human life and a fully human expression of who we are as people.
Well, I think that is actually something well worth unpacking because, well, maybe you want to relate why freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, freedom of speech, amongst the others, are part of being I'd use the term flourishing human being. But before we jump into that, I wouldn't mind you just touching on that polling result, because at one level it surprises me that so many people are supportive of that, because I find anecdotally there still seems to be a lot of people trying to shut down discussion and debate. You certainly get that censorious element. Is that just from your research then a small but vocal minority, which is, if you will, dominating the discourse, versus actually what your polling has suggested that most New Zealanders go, actually, there is a range of views here. Is that the dynamic you think is in play or something else?
I imagine it varies depending on the issue and depending on context. So I'll give you another data point, if you like. A couple of years ago, I did a full review of the constitutional elements of New Zealand's response to COVID-19. And one of the things that you see in the course of that response is that the High Court, in a couple of decisions particularly, made what I think were quite extraordinary name suppression decisions. So just for a bit of context, the usual principle is that justice is open, justice must be seen to be done. So if you go to court, the court decision is ultimately a matter of public record. Name suppression is supposed to be an exception to that. One of the reasons courts will suppress names is if they're concerned that there would be unfair or negative consequences for the people involved in the case. And in a couple of instances, there were people who took what the courts were very quick to say were perfectly legitimate challenges to COVID orders or pieces of legislation. And the court said, look, we think there's a credible prospect of professional and even physical harm to people if we don't suppress their names for bringing these kinds of challenges. Even though, I mean, these were people in some cases who were working at the border. The court said, they have personally put themselves into positions where they are at risk, they are exposed. They should not be thought of as playing any less part in New Zealand's response to COVID-19. Nevertheless, the court said we need to suppress their names so that they're not identified in this judgment, because they recognised there was sort of a broader culture of, I suppose, groupthink, if you like, a sense that, look, you actually aren't really allowed to dissent from the prevailing view, the majority view. So I think in that particular instance, what you were actually seeing and what the court was responding to was actually a not entirely uniform, because no society is completely uniform, but certainly a majority view. I think in other cases, what you see is, as you say, a vocal minority and a largely silent majority. So I think we've got a bit of a mix of things going on, depending on context.
So if we jump to that court case, and I'm a layman, you're obviously a well-respected lawyer. Are you saying that the court basically suppressed their names for fear that they could be targeted, or I'll just use that word target? Is that sort of the dynamic that I'm hearing? Have I misunderstood that?
No, I think that's right. They said, there is a possibility that these people are going to be the subject of harassment. I think they were probably particularly concerned about being identified and pursued online. And that there could be consequences for them in their employment beyond the consequences they were already facing in the cases in question. One quick clarification, by the way. I'm a former lawyer, something I gave up a while ago, and I'll just make that point. The ex-lawyer in me is very mindful to say you can only call yourself a lawyer if you hold a current practicing certificate. I don't want to get in trouble with the Law Society.
No, let's not put you in trouble.
I'll make that clear.
That is important. Well, there we go, everyone. We have an ex-lawyer and an ex-politician talking. So in some ways then, and not to get down the rabbit hole of that particular case, so at one level there's a positive from the court that they're using their power to protect these people, yet in doing so, it does reflect a little bit of society that they need to be protected, that, as you say, threats or harassment could come. So that's worrying itself, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think what we saw during the pandemic response was, I hope, sort of the high watermark of that kind of reaction to differing views. I mean, obviously there were serious issues of public health and associated kind of economic and quote unquote not quite national security issues, but issues to do with the integrity of our nation and our social fabric. So the stakes were high, no question about that. But how you respond in a crisis also reveals something about your character, and I think there were aspects of that response where we saw, despite all the talk of kindness, where we saw a lack of empathy for people who. Not even who had different beliefs, but even who asked questions. I know in many ways you talk about these sort of things and people are like, they don't want to talk about COVID. People want to move on, etc. But I do think it's important that we think about that, at least from the point of view of, look, what lessons can we learn from that? And, how can we now create a more positive culture where people are actually able to bring their beliefs, their differences of opinion, their questions to the table, and have those respected and treated as though they actually deserved a hearing and a reasonable answer.
It won't surprise you that I fully agree. I've often talked about rights existing for the bad times, and what I've meant by that, and using COVID as an example, it's not the example, but it's certainly a relevant one. That human rights exist for the bad times when things are in trouble. If all's going well, if you live in a utopia, for argument's sake, you don't need rights. I would argue that it's when times get tough, and arguably in New Zealand over recent years, and still current, which is, I think, one of the reasons Ethos Alliance exist is actually some of those fundamental rights are being challenged. And you said earlier about the link between, if you will, human rights, those freedoms, or I should use the word you used, freedoms are linked in many ways to our humanness, or our ability to flourish as humans. Do you just want to tease that out for listeners a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I meant that in sort of two ways. One is that the reason we have these rights is that we think they reflect something about what it is to be human. We're the kind of people that should be able to express ourselves. For example, if you think about freedom of expression, that should be able to associate together for common purposes. It's freedom of association. That should be able to participate in a democratic society. That's why we have rights around voting, voting, for example, and participation. So rights, at least in a kind of a classical sense, reflect this idea of we're human beings with dignity and worth. We're interdependent, and we need to be able to engage with each other. And rights help us do that in a constructive and a peaceful way, because and if you look back at history, you see the way that people have sometimes done this as an alternative is through force, through imposition, and rights protect us from that. The other thing I meant, though, is that when you think particularly about the rights we're most concerned about, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of belief, these are all really central to what's sometimes called agency, which is kind of a philosopher's word for basically the ability to make meaningful choices in your life, and the discernment to know which choices are worth making. Now, that's something that can be both that can be taught, it can be learned, it can be passed on to you. It's also something you have to form yourself through experience. And part of the reason that freedom of conscience, religion, belief, that these freedoms matter is because, first of all, they make it possible for people to share what they genuinely believe is most important, is true about the world, the structure of reality, what is good for us to do, what is not good for us to do. So there's the ability to kind of transmit those values and those beliefs. But the other thing that's really important is that these freedoms give us the opportunity to put these things into practice ourselves. And as with everything we do, that ability to practice things means sometimes that we will get it wrong. And that is actually part of the learning experience. It's part of the feedback loop, if you like. It's sort of the sense that if we didn't have that ability, if we didn't have the ability in our lives to sort of say, look, I've thought about this, I've practiced this way of living, this is what I think is truly most important. This is the sort of the set of organizing principles, organizing beliefs, organizing religion, whatever it might be, that I'm going to structure my life around. If we can't do that, then in a sense we're losing something very deeply fundamental about what it is to be human, because if we don't do that, then effectively somebody else has to do that for us. So there's a risk there of abuse of power. And so one of the things that we see, obviously, these rights, they protect us from abuses of power. They protect us from, for example, majority views, which, as Helen Alvarez, who's a professor, law professor, kind of points out the majority's often got it wrong. You look back through history and you can see that. So we want the ability to be able to think differently. But if we can't actually put those thoughts and those beliefs into practice, then in many ways we're not actually using our agency. It's not enough just to be able to have freedom of thought inside your head. You have to be able to do something with it in the real world in order for it to be you who is interacting with that world rather than somebody else. And rather than somebody else's set of values and beliefs. So that's why I say that I think these rights and freedoms, they protect something very important about what it is to be fully human. And I think, just in a really basic everyday way, we see that everybody is confronted with questions like, why am I here? Why is there something rather than nothing? What is this world for? What duties do I owe my neighbor? Should I even think of that person as my neighbor? Everybody is operating out of some set of assumptions about the answers to those questions. So we can either just assume the answers and accept them, or we can think about them and put them into practice. And agency is the latter. And I think it's one of the things that sort of brings us most fully alive as humans.
Well, it won't surprise you. I mean, we talk frequently enough that I agree with you. I think it's one of the ironies in sort of modern society at the moment that you're allowed to have agency only if it conforms with a certain array of views. So you're allowed to express opinions on various topics. You're allowed to have that agency. But at the same time, certainly from my experience, there are other topics or discussion points there. Oh, no, that's to be kept in private. That's a private matter. And for me, arguably, as a student of philosophy rather than an ex-philosopher, if you can't exercise your rights, then in effect you don't have them. And we've seen that a little bit in New Zealand over recent years, where people say, oh, you're free to have an opinion, but we're free to shut you down and stop you speaking. And you're going, no. Well, sorry, I'm saying, no, that's not right. It's what you said. You can't just have it inside your head. So you're clearly, well, maybe I'll put it this way. Are you and the Ethos Alliance then reacting to changes then in this human rights and freedom space? Have you seen a growing problem that you feel that needs to be addressed? Is this the catalyst for Ethos?
Yeah, I think I'd like to say that we're both being reactive and proactive. I hope that yes, we've seen I think changes in circumstances, changes in the environment around us, some of which give cause for concern. But I also think, just a bit more generally, these are perennially good things. The ability to have agency, to exercise freedom of conscience, freedom of belief. These are just things that should always be cherished, celebrated, promoted, because they're actually they're incredibly valuable for us, as I've already said, I suppose, for us individually and as a society. So proactively, part of the reason that we were established was to help people understand the need, and I think there is always a need to share and to communicate that. One of the American founding fathers said the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Now, we're not America, so I would sort of substitute for that the price of whatever you think is important, is truly valuable for humans. The price of democracy, the price of equality, the price of agency, of freedom, all of these things. You don't just sort of get them once and then you're done. You actually have to keep retelling the story and reminding yourselves of why these things matter and what it looks like to put them into practice, and then sort of recontextualizing that for the time that you live in, which is different from 100 years ago. It'll be different 100 years into the future. I think part of the task we all need to embark on is to understand why these things matter and how to express them in our day and age. So that's part of the genesis for what we do. You asked before about the name, which is Ethos or Ethos Alliance. And ethos is kind of the characteristic spirit or culture of an age. So that sort of captures something of what we are wanting to make a positive contribution to. And the alliance part of the name expresses the fact that one of the things we do is offer advice and advocacy and support for people that are facing some kind of challenge to living out their deepest and their most important convictions. In some cases, we do that directly. In other cases, we do that by working with an alliance of expert lawyers who can provide support for people that are facing those kind of pressures. So that could be, for example, an employee who's being put under pressure at work because of their beliefs, a doctor who's asked to participate in a procedure that goes against her conscience, a faith-based school that's facing unfair scrutiny because of their founding beliefs. Those are all the kinds of situations that I think we see in our contemporary society, and those are the kinds of situations where we want to play a role, helping people I suppose to have the courage and the confidence to stand for what they believe, but also to play a role trying to find constructive solutions, constructive ways through in these kinds of situations, which can generate more heat than light in many scenarios. And one of the core convictions that animates us is that at the same time as it's important for each of us to be able to have our different beliefs and to be able to express those in the way that we live, nevertheless, we actually have an enormous amount in common, even when we disagree about quite fundamental matters. We share a common humanity. We have common ground on many things, even with people we disagree with strongly. And we want to find as much common ground and as much solidarity as we can, while at the same time still being here for those people who say, look, honestly, this is where I stand and I just can't agree with you on this particular issue.
For me, there's a couple of really, for me, good points you've drawn out. One is that there is so much commonality. It's trying to find that ground, as you say, to discuss each other's, if you will, ethos, to use your founding word. Because, more often than not, if there's a constructive conversation, even with people who are poles apart, you can find middle ground. Certainly found that in politics, the irony being of some of my closest friends, if you will, or people I worked with, are often on the other side. It's one of these strange ironies. The other is, I really like what you said about freedoms having to be constantly worked at. Sorry, I paraphrase things differently. Or take your eloquent words and turn them into something ineloquent. But it's one of the things that does worry me, both as an ex-politician and student of philosophy, that there is a belief somehow that the freedoms and rights that we have, particularly in the Western world, just appeared, and they're just always going to be there. And it's like, no, they've got, as you say, a constant vigilance. I'm stretching my mind to try and think which of the founding fathers it was. But it's right, that constant vigilance. So you're clearly part of this, and it's clear that there's a need. There's obviously on that, you've got the advocacy side, and we might talk to at least one of those areas. I know you've recently written some opinion pieces into the euthanasia space, or the End of Life Choice Act. It's coming up for review. So you've got an advocacy side, but it's also clear you have New Zealanders who are week by week coming under pressure because of their beliefs. And so that's, I suppose, without making this sound like an advertisement, you are available for people who are finding their conscience rights, their freedoms being challenged, to come to you. And it sounds like you're a bit of a conduit. Is that the right way to think about it? To experts, lawyers and others who can help advise them?
Yeah, I think I often describe us as being sort of a hub. And as I say, in some situations, we assist directly. In other situations, whether that's for reasons of expertise or capacity, or because it might be something which there are certain areas of work that are legally reserved to lawyers, we might refer those things on to lawyers who we think will do a good job of the cases that have been brought to us. But I think the way that we want to work basically is yes, for people to be aware of us, because to your point about there being a need, that I guess that is what we're seeing. We are seeing people sort of coming forward and saying, look, I am coming under pressure, and so it's always nice to find the positive wherever you can, but sometimes you have to acknowledge, like, actually people are being put under pressure for their beliefs, and that can be a very difficult, challenging situation to find yourself in, particularly when these are beliefs that are actually really core to your identity, and so it can be very stressful. And what we're wanting to offer is holistic support, I suppose, in these situations. So not just kind of a conduit to a lawyer, but a sense of, look, this is what we are focused on. We care about these issues. We understand why they matter, and as you say, we are available to help people with sort of a spectrum of support when they're facing these kinds of challenges that we know can have a real cost.
So pretty important for me then to say or echo back what you've said. There's a whole range. I was going to use the word panoply. There's a whole range of support that can be provided. It's not just racing off with lawyers. It is at times, isn't it? I think you've talked a few cases, high level and discreet, that it's just conversations. Actually being able to go in and just have a conversation with the respective parties and say, how can we mutually find a way forward here? So in other words, things don't always have to be litigated.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it can be as simple as you say, as just having conversations. There's also a real need, I think, just for a kind of practical wisdom about how you go about these things. And it is it's a human response, but it's easy to be defensive when you find yourself in the middle of these situations for very good reasons. I mean, particularly if you are being challenged, you want to defend yourself. And
Which
there's
is
also an
why it
element
says
as
me.
well of what.
It's why it says me actually having people like yourself is helpful. It can help temper that anger, frustration, fear, whatever that range of emotions are. So yeah, having people like yourself to bounce the ideas and help mediate is of enormous benefit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something we all benefit from. Counsel of others, hopefully wise counsel, and as well just just to your point about sort of a range of possible support, just being aware that because these kinds of issues can take a bit of a toll on people, it can be important to access things like pastoral support, and maybe to have a wider network of connections who are again thinking about these kinds of issues, who can offer something and who can speak into these kinds of issues when they arise, which might complement the more legal side of things as well. So that's really I suppose the headline thing that we're set up for. But I guess one of the things that I would want to emphasize about our work is that while we also exist for those sort of reactive cases where somebody comes along and says, I'm facing this kind of a challenge, we also very much want to work proactively and say, look, these are the kinds of issues that we think are important, or the kinds of issues that people are bringing to us. How can we engage well with those issues at the level of issues before they start affecting individual people, where things actually often get much more difficult to resolve constructively. And so that's why we engage in kind of public education around these rights and freedoms, around their importance, and also around the kinds of issues that people are bringing to us. So if I give you an example, since we were set up roughly a year ago, kind of really got active towards the end of last year, we had a number of school leaders, parents, teachers, and so on coming to us, asking sort of quite similar questions around gender identity, and particularly what's sometimes called social transition of gender. So that's things like changing a name, changing preferred pronouns for a student. And what these people were typically asking us is, what's the best way to care for students when they're raising these kind of questions, and actually what does the law allow us to do? Now, one way to respond to those sort of situations is you wait till you've got an actual student asking these questions and you're trying to figure it out. But I think a better way to answer these kind of questions is to say, can we think about this in advance? Can we, as it were, get ahead of the curve, and just think about, well, if we take a dispassionate look at the medical evidence, the scientific evidence, and the legal framework, what are the options that schools actually have? And that's an easier conversation to have, one that I think can end better when you are having that kind of at a level of principle. And so we created guidelines which we shared with every school in New Zealand, which basically looked at each of those questions, medical evidence, and legal framework, and that concluded that an approach that's often called watchful waiting, which is basically a developmentally informed approach that sort of asks careful, what I would call careful questions about individual situations. How old is the child who's asking about this? Are their parents aware and involved? Is there a medical involved? What's their diagnosis? Do they have relevant expertise? Does the child have coexisting conditions that might need support? What we were really saying is this kind of approach is actually a legitimate and a legal policy option for schools, who are often told that when a child asks these kind of questions, what you've got to do is actually immediately affirm. Effectively meaning if they're asking about changing their pronouns, the right answer is just say, yep, we will do that. Without stopping to ask those questions. And we thought it was really important that schools know that actually the law doesn't require that approach, even though there are some fairly motivated people telling them that's what's required. And in fact, we think a better position under the law, for schools who have a legal obligation to keep their students safe, a better position under the law is that you actually take this more kind of considered and exploratory approach, which is actually becoming best practice in countries like Sweden, Finland, and England, that have all kind of conducted reviews in this area in recent times.
Having read your advice, and obviously I've got my views on these things, I thought it was actually just that, what did you say, proactive? It's a developing issue. So many people are wondering how to engage it. So I think it's a wonderful illustration of that proactive work. I thought it was actually very empathetic. And it doesn't surprise me, not only knowing yourself and the work that the Alliance does, but actually when you are engaging the science and the wider discussion, I think it does generate an empathy. But the third element I thought was really important, and you touched on, is people are often being told, or in this case, schools are being told, there's only one way to do things, this way, and this is the legal way, when that's often not the case. I mean, particularly in this gender identity in schools, there are multiple approaches. You've articulated one, but the law is also slightly ambiguous on this. It's not actually prescriptive in the way that some activists would like schools to think. As you say, there's multiple approaches, and so you're feeding into that conversation. I know the other element that you're working at the moment, you've written recently around euthanasia, and if I might, and correct me on any of this, that one of the core points is around conscience rights.
Yes.
And that seems to be potentially under threat. You might want to elaborate for listeners why that might be the case. And you're linking that, if I've read it correctly, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, you've got conscience rights, but on the other hand, if there's to be an expansion around euthanasia, you're going to see more doctors concerned about what's happening. Or put it, again, quite crudely, at the moment, most doctors don't want to be involved with very narrow criteria. If it expands, and it likely is, you're going to have even more doctors arguably finding themselves challenged. And yet, simultaneously, there's the potential that these conscience rights might go or be taken away.
Yeah, I think the point that you made about what the majority of doctors think. So both before and after the euthanasia law was implemented, the End of Life Choice Act, you've got a majority of doctors who are opposed to it. And just as a quick bit of context, the law requires that it be reviewed later this year. It's got to be reviewed periodically. So the first review is supposed to be taking place towards the end of this year. And we've already seen from advocates who are starting to kind of come out in various kind of public forums and in the media that there's a real desire to expand the eligibility criteria in the Act. So, for example, there's a petition before Parliament at the moment to expand the law to include what have been called degenerative diseases. You've got some people who the media has profiled who are raising concerns about what they call a quote-unquote dementia tsunami. And against that kind of background, you've got people saying, look, at the moment, the law is focused on what is usually described as terminal illness. So somebody who has a prognosis of 6 months or less to live. We'll just move past the fact that prognosis is not an exact science. And most people know someone who's been given that kind of prognosis only to outlive it. So whether or not those are in fact as terminal as they sound, let's leave that to one side for the moment. But there's definitely a desire to see the coverage of the Act expanded. I mean, David Seymour, who's one of the architects of the Act, has made no secret of that. So I think it's very likely that when the review happens, that will be one of the key things that they will be looking at, and that there will certainly be some that'll feature in some way in their conclusions, whether they support that or not. I think it'll be a key bone of contention. And one of the issues that you have at the moment is that as a doctor, if you do not want to participate in the practice of euthanasia or assisted suicide, there's a provision in the Act that says you don't have to do that, but you do have to tell a patient where they can access relevant details in order that they can find somebody who will have that conversation with them. I think at the moment you've got some doctors who I believe are concerned with that requirement. But even for those doctors who might say, well, just giving people information, telling people where they can go to find information, I mean, ironically, you can get that information yourself with a quick Google. So maybe I'm okay with that because the patient can find it out anyway. But there are other obligations on the doctor in the Act as well. If a patient does approach them about euthanasia, like giving information about a prognosis, like seeing that they are making their decisions free from pressure, that they are encouraged to talk to others about their wish, their condition, and their wish for euthanasia. And as the coverage of the Act expands, I think it's quite plausible that what you might find is that some doctors who sort of say, look, at the moment, this is the current Act is going to cover, it's going to be like your end stage cancer patients, etc. I can live with that. But who sort of say, well, if what we're now talking about is, Parkinson's and dementia, which are the kind of conditions that you see covered in overseas jurisdictions like Canada. Actually, I'm not so comfortable with that, and I'm not really convinced that the obligations that the Act imposes on me are actually realistic. So I actually don't really want to be engaged with that process. So if that's what a doctor's thinking, you're going to have more doctors who are starting to have concerns about personally engaging with participating in the process of euthanasia. And so I think we would expect to see a greater range of conscience concerns. One of the things we also want to think about and look at is the extent to which what's sometimes been called institutional conscientious objection is going to be important. Partly as euthanasia becomes a sort of a more normalized practice, those organizations, classically like hospice, individual hospices, for example, who sort of say, as an institution or as an organization, this is not something we do. There's probably going to be increasing pressure on that institutional position. So we think it's really important that all of these things are brought to the fore when the review is taking place later this year.
Well, again, it won't surprise you. I'm 100% behind you. It's what I do worry about, those two trajectories, both widening the scope of euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, and the conscience rights. In fact, during the debates in Parliament, that was a big thing. They didn't actually want them. And maybe it's more of a broad philosophical point to throw at you, but there seems to be, and not just in euthanasia, a move over recent years that if the state, or in this case the Crown in New Zealand, passes a law, then that which it passes becomes moral. Hence, you don't need conscience rights. For me, it's quite an insidious move. Countries, states, crowns pass laws. It doesn't always make them right or moral, but we do seem to have this mindset, and I certainly came across it a few times in parliamentary debates where people were like, no, it's now the law, therefore it is good, it's right, it's ethical, and you're going, well, not necessarily. Those two things can be separate. I should phrase that as a question. Are they separate, or are those alternative views correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly what you would like is, I think, for law to reflect, what's truly good for people. But even if what law is doing is merely making something permissible, there is a perfectly legitimate range of views on whether that thing is actually beneficial. And part of the dynamic that I think you see with some of these conscience debates in areas like euthanasia or in other kind of medical areas as well, is that there's what one researcher and writer has sort of talked about as, doctors as just providers of a service. So there's sort of a view that I think is emergent that, this thing's legal, this thing is scientifically or technologically possible, I want it, the doctor should give it to me. Rather than sort of seeing doctors or other professionals in other areas as somebody who actually core to what they do, core to their profession, to the service they provide, and to their individual identity and integrity, is that they are people who make informed conscience judgments, and they do this continually throughout their practice. So this isn't just something that comes up when you're talking about a contentious procedure like euthanasia. In fact, being a good doctor or lawyer or architect or accountant or person, really, but being a good person means you are continually making considered conscience judgments about, is this a a good, morally or ethically a good thing to do? Also, is it practically wise? And so if you start to strip that element out of something like the practice of medicine, you don't just affect the provision of something like euthanasia, you actually affect the way that that doctors and other professionals are fundamentally seen and over time fundamentally think of themselves, and you lose something very important from the practice of those professions. Which is actually that ability to make the kind of informed expert judgment that we go to a doctor for. If I go to a doctor and say, look, I'm having this problem and this is the solution and I want that solution, I may have Googled that. I didn't go to med school, and so what I actually need is the doctor to some extent tell me what I need. And that's actually a really important judgment and a really important facility that we have to preserve.
Yeah, it's one of those even wider dynamics, isn't it? That we're removing a core part of what it means to be human, I would argue, which is actually using our judgment, our moral views. At times I'll contest with a patient or a client, but that's all part of being human. Yeah. So Alex, you've clearly got, and the Ethos Alliance, a lot on your plate, but it's just fantastic to get a whole series of insights into what you do. If people need to get hold of you or they want to read some of your opinion pieces, and they are opinion pieces, and also news releases, where do they go? How do people find you?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. The best way is just to go straight to the website, which is ethosalliance.nz. You can find our work there, our research publications, our commentary and our analysis. If you're interested in following along, there's the ability to sign up for notifications, for updates. We put out a monthly newsletter where we sort of round up the work that we've been doing and the things that we're engaged in that we think people should be aware of. And so you can find all of that there and follow along with our work.
I certainly recommend to viewers and listeners to sign up. That they're not spamming you, I can tell you that, and also it's just a really great summary of some of the really critical ethical, moral and legal issues in front of us. So Alex, to you and the Alliance, thanks so much for all you're doing, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Simon. Always great to talk with you.